Well, welcome to the channel. Again, I'm Randy Broussard, your host. I have a very, very special guest with me today, Mr. Stewart Fillmore, who's a retired agent who served with the FBI for 29 years, began his career as a support employee, then promoted pretty quickly to a special agent. He was assigned to Dallas, Little Rock, Chicago, the Tyler, Texas offices. Career street agent, he worked most of the criminal investigations under jurisdiction of the FBI. His primary specialty was investigating public corruption. One of the high-profile cases was captured in his book that he wrote, Tinaha. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Tenaha.
Tinaha, I'm sorry. Corruption and cover-up in a small, I knew I would get it wrong, Texas town. The story provides an insight look how the FBI investigated public corruption and how it worked. In July of 2021, Mr. Fillmore was featured on Expedition Unknown on the Discovery Channel, an episode entitled Dillinger's Lost Loot, which highlighted a 1934 Shell Oil Company road map he found at the John Dillinger Farm in Mooresville, Indiana. I had to include that in there as well. Fascinating. Most recently, though, he's been the co-host of a true crime podcast entitled Back in Crime, along with a retired Secret Service agent, Todd Hiles, where they bring parallel expertise and decades of experience to the forefront by peeling back layers of criminal investigations, unraveling shocking details, and sharing unique insights into cases he has personally worked on, and including some he'd wish he'd work on, which brings us to the main subject at hand today, the JFK assassination. Just a
Yeah.
few years ago, Mr. Fillmore embarked on an extensive investigation into this case in just a few short years, has gotten incredibly far. New revelations, new evidence, challenging the widely accepted narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He focuses primarily on the medical and forensic evidence to determine whether there were two shooters. Mr. Fillmore, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy, for having me. I really look forward to this. This will be great.
Great. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, I want to just mention something before I ask you questions. Thank you for your service, by the way. It must have been just an incredible experience. I've always admired the FBI, and you must have some interesting stories, I bet. Thanks for
You,
backing
Thank you. I really appreciate that. My grandfather actually was an FBI agent from 1941 to 1962. He really died before I got to know him. I was very young. I have a vague memory of him. But it's just funny that I didn't really set out to be in the FBI because of him, but it's just one of those things that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And
Right.
it just was it just fit my personality overall. I'm a puzzle solver by nature, and the nature of the work to me was just solving puzzles, and that's what I like to do. I do that regardless of whether you're paying me or not.
Well,
So I was really, really lucky and blessed to have fallen into it.
well, thanks for again, thanks for your service.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off by asking you, like I ask a lot of the researchers and even myself, how did you get started with the Kennedy assassination? I know you've gotten just very, very interesting theories, a lot of new information, and I know we've spoke this for a period of time. You really believe the Warren Commission, Oswald acted
Mhm.
alone, like many have.
Yeah.
Sure, at first we all had to believe it, but how did what kind of triggered you to kind of go in that direction, the Kennedy assassination? What interested you?
Well, so the podcast that you mentioned, Back in Crime, that's just kind of a natural thing for me because I've always, for whatever reason, I really wouldn't want to know what the psychological, profile is as to why I like this. But, all my life, I've been drawn to gangsters and gunfighters. And just stories like the Wyatt Earp and the shootout gunfight at the OK Corral, that kind of stuff has just fascinated me all my life. And I also, like I said, I'm a puzzle solver, so I'm drawn to unsolved cases, unsolved mysteries of many different kinds. And I don't think there's any really greater mystery, if you will, than the Kennedy assassination. So I've always had kind of a historical interest in it. I've read a few books. I think really the first book I read, well, to backtrack, people from my generation, we, we trusted the government. This was all before Watergate. And, we just thought everybody in the government is a good guy, and what the government says is the government doesn't lie to us. So, I just had really never questioned, the Kennedy assassination. I knew there were some curious elements to it. And then I read in the late 80s, I read Jim Garrison's book on the Trail of the Assassins. And that got me to thinking, wow, man, there's some weird stuff here, going on in New Orleans, and and then maybe a couple 3 years after On the Trail of the Assassins is when Gerald Posner's book came out, Case Closed, and I read Case Closed, and you have to acknowledge that Posner did a thorough job. It was well sourced, and he made a compelling case. And so, I kind of swung back to, well, yeah, there are some funky things, but for the most part, I think the government probably got it right. I was young in my career at that time, and so, had other things going. So I didn't really focus on, on it. I didn't have the time for it, but I would read stuff here and there. But for the most part, I just went back to the old belief that, that Oswald acted alone. So fast forward to last fall, or I'm sorry, the fall of 2023, I saw this documentary on Paramount called JFK: What the Doctors Saw. And they interviewed 10 of the doctors that had treated President Kennedy at Parkland. And what I was struck by was how competent and intelligent and credible, these doctors were. And essentially what they described seeing was a small wound in the throat that was small, round, and clean, and then a gaping hole in the back of the right part of the back of his head. And to me, that's what these men described seeing. Were they wrong? Whatever, because what they're describing is indicative of a shooter in the front. And so from there, I just thought, well, okay, forget for a second what the government conclusion is. If the doctors are right, and this is indicative of a shooter in the front, where would the shooter have been? And that's really what started, how I started looking into this in depth.
Exactly. And I did watch that documentary. It's fantastic. And now, is it true that the interviews were conducted earlier, not in 2023, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I think actually that whole documentary was filmed in 2013. 10 years before it was released. So why it sat in the can, I don't really know.
A little suspicious to me.
There's a lot of things. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this, and that's something that I've found as I've gone along is it's almost in some ways trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that you don't know if it's from the right puzzle that you're trying to solve. There's a lot of funky things in it.
Yeah, and how can all those doctors be wrong? I can't imagine.
That's really what boggles my mind. And as you get further into it, what you find is that folks at the autopsy also saw this gaping hole in the occipital area. There were only a few that saw the wound in the throat before Dr. Perry did the tracheostomy, which was certainly justified because the president was still alive and they're trying to save his life. And so, unfortunately, at least from an evidentiary standpoint, that wound was altered, but with good reason. I mean, there's you can't fault what they were trying to do, but so at the autopsy that just looked, they assumed that was I think there's varying accounts of what they thought it was, but I think for the most part they thought that was just a tracheostomy and not a gunshot wound. But we now know that that several of the autopsy personnel there told the HSCA, that he had this gaping hole in the rear of his head, and the two FBI agents, Seibert and O'Neill, documented it. So were all these people wrong? You really have to ask that hard question. And I think it's been documented there are about 40 people from Parkland through the autopsy, including some funeral home guys. That Tom
Hmm.
Robinson was the funeral home guy. The photographer, other people, just the personnel in the autopsy, all said, a good portion of his brain is gone. Secret Service agent said that. Clint Hill said it. And he's got this big hole in the occipital area. Well, then you see this one picture from the autopsy with the back of his head, and it's that right occipital area is completely intact. So you have to assume then that almost 40 very competent professional people, including a neurosurgeon, Kemp Clark, who you would assume would know when he sees a gaping hole in the skull with cerebellum exuding from it, that he would know what he's seeing, that he didn't just daydream that. And yet there's a photograph that, on first glance, it's hard to argue, well, there's a photograph that clearly shows that intact, and there's no cerebellum there's no hole for cerebellum to ooze from. So really, the whole thing boils down to that. If you either have 40 people that are grossly incompetent or lying, or that photograph is fraudulent. There's no other options. That's the only thing you're left with.
And I know you probably heard this, I think David Lipton's book, that there could have been surgery performed before the autopsy. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, so I actually, I said I think the first book I read was Garrison's book, but actually I want to say that I had read sometime in the mid or early '80s. I did read Case Closed, or let me correct that. I tried to read it. I actually at the time I guess I found it kind of difficult to follow. Lifton describes this surgery happening on the president. I guess maybe on the plane or in some ways, kind of. And I have to admit, he kind of lost me, on that regard, because that just seems outrageous.
Yeah.
But man, and this is not an area that I gave that on the investigation I've done for the last year that I've looked that hard into, although I've read it just in looking for other stuff.
Hmm.
But there is some funkiness that goes on when the president's body arrives at Bethesda. That I think there's about 45 minutes that's where it's
Right.
unaccounted for, where apparently
What happened there?
yeah, they switched some caskets going on and that
Hmm.
kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
it's certainly possible that this surgery that Seibert and O'Neill described in their FBI 302, where they, I think they said, quote, that Hume said there was surgery of the head, that there certainly is a moment where that, there's a period of time where that becomes possible. So again, that's all very, very suspicious.
It is.
Well, in fact, there's just no limit to the problems with that autopsy. There really is.
And that's why I know you're advocating just, you should mention that, advocating a second autopsy, correct?
Well, so again, when I started off, my main focus was to determine, if these Parkland doctors are correct, they're pretty much describing a shooter in the front, and so I just set out to try to find where that shooter was. Okay, and so that was the large focus of what I looked at, and I primarily focused on that throat wound because there was quite a bit of description of it from Dr. Perry and the autopsy, and actually some of the later X-ray analysis from the HSCA that allowed me to construct a bullet path and a bullet trajectory that kind of pinpoints where a shooter might have been in the front, and it was not the grassy knoll.
Right.
And so
So where was it where you were?
so okay, so if if you consider where the president was sitting in the limousine around the time of the throat shot, he's about 100, the limousine would have been about 130 feet from the intersection of Elm and Houston. And the limousine's coming down Elm Street. And roughly around that time is when the throat shot happened. So from all photographs that I've seen and analyzed, the president was pretty much sitting in a normal upright posture. He wasn't drastically bending forward or bending backward or turned drastically one way or the other. He did have his arm up on the side of the car. But for the most part, he was just in a normal upright posture. So if you assume that, the location of the limousine, and if you construct this bullet path that is described, in the available evidence, then that bullet path actually points to about 20 degrees to the president's left, if you extend it forward, and that where that line goes is to the very northwest corner of the parking lot of the Terminal Annex building. And where that would be is on top of something called the South Knoll. So we've always heard of the Grassy Knoll. The Grassy Knoll sits to the north of Elm Street, and the South Knoll is its mirror image that sits to the north of Commerce Street in Dealey Plaza. And so there's a parking lot that's on top of the South Knoll. And just like there's a parking lot on the Grassy Knoll, but there's a fence along the Grassy Knoll, but the South Knoll does not have a fence.
And you came up with a picture of possibly.
Yeah. So I had, when I realized that I had this 20-degree line that pointed, 20 degrees to the president's left, that's when I tried to find any kind of photo I could find. And there's a famous photo called Cancellari number 5, taken by UPI photographer Frank Cancellari. And in the background of his photograph, which is looking to the west, or really the southwest, you can see a car that's parked in the corner of this Terminal Annex parking lot. It's about 15 feet from the end of the triple underpass wall, and there's a car there. And if you zoom in, within the car, there is very clearly a human figure that's sitting in the driver's seat. Now, can I say emphatically that's a human being? No, but I can tell you it's a car for certain, and I can tell you that this figure, you can see shoulders and head and torso, the shape, and it's in where the driver's seat would be. So those all kind of match up that this is a person, in a car. And the line that you extend from President Kennedy's throat wound goes right straight to that car. And if you look at it from overhead, it jumps out at you. So, so that was my main focus on that. And so one of the things that I did from there was, I made the assumption that, okay, this was a shot that would have had to go through the windshield. And there's an entire controversy about the windshield that a researcher named Doug Weldon has done the lion's share of the work on that and documented people that say there was a bullet hole in the windshield. I pretty much stay away from that. I'll let Weldon's work speak for itself. Again, I went on the assumption that I'm operating just on what I would have known had I interviewed the Parkland doctors that morning. So I just made the assumption that this would have gone through the windshield. And so if that's true, we have a wound that was described as clean, round, and small, which means that's basically an entry wound that is traveling roughly horizontal or level with the president. Because a wound that was traveling at an angle will make an oval-shaped wound. So we have a round, clean one. That also means that by being clean, that means the edges of it are not torn or jagged or irregular. That means that the bullet was most likely it had not fragmented. So you have a bullet then that punches through a windshield, doesn't fragment, doesn't tumble, and I made the assumption that such a bullet I think there's a most possibility that would not have stopped in the president. That would have continued out. And we know that there is a wound, a gunshot wound in his back, but that's officially an entry wound. Although there's some questions about that too. But regardless, I just made the assumption with a, well, I don't know of, of a true exit wound back there, but I think I might have a bullet that, you know, that I think would have exited. And so I wanted to see if there's any indication, and I mainly thought that there's a live oak tree, that live oak tree that would have been behind him on that line, that there might be some indication of bullet scarring or damage on that tree that might still be there 60 years later. That's the odds of that are not very big, but it was worth to me going to Dealey Plaza and actually walking that line and to see. And I inspected the tree, and there's really no damage on it. So I continued beyond that, beyond the tree, following that same 20-degree line, extended to the back from the back of the president, and it goes to the front door of the Texas School Book Depository. Okay, and on that, at the front entrance, there are 4 concrete pillars, 2 concrete pillars on the left side and 2 on the right side. And I, was just kind of visually scanning the whole entrance there. And at 9 feet 6 inches off the ground, there are 2 bullet holes or bullet strikes in the left and the right pillars on the right side of the entrance. The bullet holes were oval shaped, meaning they hit at an angle, and the long axes of these ovals went from 7 o'clock to 2 o'clock, which means it was shot as you're facing the building. It would have come from the left of the building, and that's exactly where this South Knoll position is. I just found that was pretty compelling stuff. There's just more than coincidence that all these things, kind of match up. So I kind of started looking into whether the possibility that the South Knoll shooter could have also, if there was a South Knoll shooter, that is. And again, I'm not saying this is all definitive. This is just what I found, and it's pretty interesting stuff. So I just considered the possibility: could the South Knoll shooter have made, the fatal headshot? And so when you look into that, using the same analysis of potential bullet paths, bullet trajectories, again, it does match up. It is a possible shot from there. And so a lot of people want to know, well, what happened with the, you see the president clearly going back into the left. Well, I have to admit that, well, let me say one thing real quickly. So when I first, especially when I found the Cancellari photograph, and when you zoom in, you can see this person in this car. It occurred to me, I cannot be the first person that has found this. Someone has to have found this, but previously. So I set out to try to see, what other work had been done on this. And I found a couple of people. There's forget his first name, but his last name's Di Fiore, has a website where he essentially followed the same logic I did. And then another, she had been a forensic investigator named Sherry Feaster, who actually wrote a book on her findings. And she also came to the same conclusion that if this, if what the Parkland doctor saw was an entry wound, it came from the South Knoll. There's just it just all adds up. And she, her estimate of where the shooter would have been also points to that corner of the Terminal Annex parking lot, but neither Feaster nor Di Fiore actually zoomed into the Cancellari photo close enough, because I think Sherry actually came up with a cone, what she called a cone of possibility of where the shooter would be. Well, guess what? That car is literally in the middle of that cone. And so,
you've gotten away easily too. Right? Easily got
so again, following that same methodology, I'm telling you, the ballistics added up for that shot to come from there. But I was going to say, to explain the back into the left movement, it was actually Sherry that had the analogy of it, and I'm sorry if it's in poor taste, but when you hear it, you get it immediately. If you assume that the limousine itself is the top of a pool table, and that the president's head is a pool ball that you want to put in the right corner pocket, and the South Knoll shooter's bullet is the cue ball,
Mhm.
you would aim for the left side of his head, and that would force him to go back into his. It would be the shooter's right, but it would be Kennedy's left,
That makes,
and so um, it absolutely is possible from there.
I'm sure. We
So
only have a couple of minutes left. We got,
yeah, go ahead, Randy.
yeah, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
so to me, I just consider that if you add all these things up, there's been this ongoing debate about whether there's a conspiracy or not, and it occurred to me if a second autopsy was done on the president, okay, you could definitively tell whether there's this gaping hole in the skull, in the back of the skull, and you could absolutely know that there was a shooter from the front, okay? And I think rather than argue about all the different things that are present, in this case, and there's a lot of unanswered things, no doubt about it, but the most logical and efficient way to solve this thing is to do a second autopsy. And frankly, he never got a good autopsy to begin with.
Right.
So a modern one now
I
would
agree.
be the right thing to do, I think.
Where can people get in touch with you? We have about a minute and a half left.
Yeah, so our podcast is Back in Crime. It's a play on going back in time. We just talk about old crime things that are interesting to us, and that's going to be the main area where I'm at.
Well, Mr. Fillmore, time just flew by. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Randy. I had fun. I really appreciate the invitation.